Welcome to the Jared Powell Podcast. This is Eric Wadera.
This is Alex Smith.
And Alex, we had a little hiatus, but we're back.
We're back. We have vacationed. Been to London. I've been to Kauai. Life's good. Back in studio.
And I have been eagerly awaiting this podcast. But before we go to the topic, who do we have with us today?
We have an all-star cast. We have Heather Whitson, who's a geriatrician and professor of medicine at Duke and director of the Duke Center for the Study of Aging and Human Development and co-leader of the Duke UNC Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. Heather, welcome to the Jared Powell Podcast.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for covering this topic.
And we're delighted to welcome back Jason Karlawish, who's a geriatrician and professor of medicine at Penn and director of the Penn Memory Center. He's been on several podcasts about this issue. Jason, welcome back to Jared Powell.
It's great to be back, Alex and Eric. Hi.
And we have Lon Schneider, who is professor of psychiatry, neurology, and gerontology at USC and director of the California Alzheimer's Disease Center. Welcome, Lon, to Jared Powell.
Thank you.
So we're going to be talking about redefining Alzheimer's disease. But before we go into that topic, Heather, I think you have a song request.
I'm requesting the song Don't You Forget About Me, which is one of the things that I think matters most to patients and families living with Alzheimer's disease.
Wonderful.
Won't you come see about me? I'll be alone, dancing, you know it, baby. Tell me your troubles and doubts, giving me everything inside and out and out. Love's strange, so real in the dark. Think of the tender things that we were working on. Slow change may pull us apart. When the light gets into your heart, baby, don't you forget about me. Don't you forget about me. Don't you.
A bit of an irony there that it's Simple Minds is the band.
Good point.
Oh, well. Because it is ultimately about the mind.
That's right.
So we got a big topic. We're going to be talking about redefining Alzheimer's disease and a push to move from a clinical syndrome to a biological definition. There's a lot been going on in the last 6 months with the NIA and the AA putting out draft recommendations about this issue. But I wonder if even before we talk about how do we redefine Alzheimer's disease, maybe we could just chat briefly about how is it currently defined? Just to let you know, I did look it up today. As a geriatrician, you'd imagine I'd know, but I decided I'm going to go to the CDC website. They say Alzheimer's disease is the most common type of dementia. It's a progressive disease beginning with mild memory loss and possible leading to loss of ability to carry on conversations, blah, blah, blah. Alzheimer's Association says Alzheimer's is a type of dementia that affects memory, thinking, and behavior. I'm going to turn to you, Jason. How do we currently define Alzheimer's? Again, those are for lay public definitions.
Yeah, one word and only one word there is driving me nuts, and that's type. And I know everyone talks about Alzheimer's as a, quote, type of dementia. I would say Alzheimer's is a cause of dementia, just like Lewy body disease is a cause of dementia, just like progressive supranuclear palsy is a cause of dementia, syphilis in its tertiary state. And I guess what I'm getting at is that there's this disease that can cause dementia, and one of them is Alzheimer's. I haven't exactly answered your question, but the reason why I'm hanging up on that word type is it's getting us back to 1980s, a la the music we just heard, 1980s nomenclature that to have Alzheimer's, you had dementia, and the two were sort of intermeshed even to the point in the 80s, the thought was all dementia is Alzheimer's, or it's some medical illness or combination of other stuff that's not about it. And I think we've moved far away from this idea that you have to have dementia to have Alzheimer's, and that it is a, quote, type of dementia.
Yeah. What do you think, Heather?
Yeah, so this was, I have thought a lot about this the more that I work with neurologists, because I think there was some epiphany that I had about a decade ago when I realized that we didn't mean the same thing when we were saying Alzheimer's disease. And this was, a decade ago. And I realized that as a geriatrician, when I was talking about Alzheimer's disease, I was really talking about, I was picturing in my mind people that have dementia and people that I treat with sometimes very advanced dementia. My neurology colleagues, what they were picturing in their mind was plaques and tangles, and almost seeing the person there, but seeing as if they could see inside their brain to the slides and the plaques and the tangles. And the truth is, I kind of think we were both right. And it was a helpful epiphany to me to kind of knit those things together. But it was also helpful to realize that, so again, as a person whose mission now is to try to prevent and cure this disease, I think it's really important to think about the plaques and the tangles. But I think what Jason said is also really important, that the plaques and the tangles are the disease that cause the dementia, which is the thing that people really care about. And so I understand the reason for defining it based on the biology and the pathology. I also think that there are whole swaths of people, not just physicians, but also lots of patients and families who for many, many years weren't thinking plaques and tangles at all when you say the word Alzheimer's disease. And we can't just ignore that link is not there in the minds of a lot of people who are important stakeholders in this field.
Mm-hmm.
I was about to disagree with you, but then I got lost in what you were saying. So it's
lost in a bad way or a good way?
Lost
like it didn't make sense, or lost like beautiful.
Like the Breakfast Club, like
yeah.
We're trying to reach across these differences and specialty and professions and background to understand these things. Go ahead, Lon.
If we stay on the idea of plaque and tangle pathology, or plaque and tangle disease, using the term loosely, we've got the 1906 definition of Alzheimer's disease, which is still the current diagnosis. We apply it to somebody who has pretty much a cortical dementia with memory impairment, who's generally old, and who on autopsy, or for that matter on a PET scan, has plaques and has tangles and loss of neurons. And that's a definition. The idea, though, is that you also need to have some symptomatology to make it a disease. You've got to have some cognitive impairment, some impairment. That makes it a disease over the observations of pathology. And that's, in my view, as analogous as to any other illness. You can easily have fibrinoid necrosis of your kidneys and not have hypertension. But the pathology of hypertension is most commonly associated with fibrinoid necrosis. So,
but what about cancer?
Lon, you can have hypertension and have no signs and symptoms. Indeed, wasn't it the silent killer?
Well, there the sign and symptom is the sign is the measurement of the high blood pressure.
Mm-hmm. Okay, which is the pathophysiologic measure, like a measure of, say, like
a temperature, and you may or may not have. That is the sign. That is the symptom.
Part of the question is, so is it like cancer where you see some abnormality, that most likely that cancer will get worse over time. You can see it. Or is it more like, let's say, hypertension, where you have an abnormal value, which may lead to another disease? So is this like, should we be calling this beta amyloidosis, which will lead to, once they have symptoms, Alzheimer's disease?
I think that's the conceptual issue that the field's struggling with. I do, which is amyloid a abnormality along a pathophysiologic continuum such that amyloid, like glycosylated hemoglobin, we all have a level of glycosylated hemoglobin. If we didn't, we'd be dead. But there's some level of glycosylated hemoglobin which very neatly correlates with abnormal glucose tolerance, which is diabetes. Okay? Or is amyloid like mitotic figures spreading beyond the basement membrane? By definition, pathologic, that is cancer. And I don't get in these new criteria, where is amyloid? Is it a point along a continuum like hemoglobin A1C? That is to say, there's a level of amyloid which would be acceptable as part of just our physiology? Or is it mitotic figures? The mere presence is disease. I don't know. I cannot tell from the new criteria.
So from the new criteria, it could make you very dizzy. But from the standard criteria, it's like you can't have Alzheimer's disease, dementia, Alzheimer's disease, mild cognitive impairment, unless you have plaques and tangles, unless you have plaques. You need the plaques to have that illness. However, you can have plaques and tangles and not have dementia.
Yeah.
And before, can I take a step back real quick? Just for the audience, I'm going to let Heather go next. Just for the audience, we're talking about, this is the NIA and the AA have been doing these frameworks since 2011, mainly for research. There's new drafts out there that's pushing for changing to a biological definition where you don't have to have symptoms to be defined as having Alzheimer's disease. And specifically, their position is beta amyloidosis. This is directly from their article draft, which we'll have on our website. Beta amyloidosis, so having amyloid in your brain or in high levels in your plasma, defines the initially detectable stage of Alzheimer's disease. And the disease exists when the earliest manifestation of AD pathophysiology can be detected, even though the onset of symptoms may be years in the future. I think that's the underlying.
Pick up that implication. They twist it and they say, even though the onset will be in the future.
The symptom onset.
Even though there won't be onset. Because most people won't develop symptoms.
Yeah, that's really what I want to stay with is I'm very curious, Lon and Jason's thoughts on this. The asymptomatic person that has, and we could even get more specific than amyloid, but has, as Jason said, pathology or amyloid 42, A beta 42 that is perivascular and certainly looks like it's on the track to eventually being what we would all agree is Alzheimer's disease, and that person likely is going to develop cognitive symptoms, but they haven't now. The value versus the harm of labeling that person today with Alzheimer's disease, the same way that, if I don't have any symptoms, but if I had a colonoscopy in a couple of months and they determined that I had a pathological tumor, I would not reject the idea that I had cancer. I would say, yes, I have cancer, even though I'm not having any symptoms. Pathology says I do. What do you think is the harm and the benefit of shifting our thinking so that we would find a person that had, and right now we might have imperfect biomarkers, but let's say we had more perfect biomarkers that could say this does look like this is amyloidopathy that is consistent with what will eventually develop into Alzheimer's dementia. Would you still reject the idea of calling those people Alzheimer's disease before they have symptoms?
If the actuarial data that described beta amyloidosis in the brain was sufficiently compelling of the likelihood of developing dementia, you could make the argument that I'll call that the disease, period. And of course, all the things that flow from that you're gesturing to, Heather, follow, namely the burden of that label on someone's sense of self-efficacy, how they're treated by other people, in a word, the stigmas that surround the disease. So I think I'm willing, though, to separate those very important social and cultural issues from what does the biology and the science tell us. I just don't think that the biology and science that surrounds beta amyloidosis alone is sufficient to rise to the level I'm going to call it a disease. I think that the actuarial data are compelling, that elevated amyloid alone in some individuals can lead to downstream dementia. But I think defining a disease on actuarial bases alone is very difficult for reasons related to cohort bias, et cetera. The strongest evidence, I think, to help define a disease on the basis of, if you will, a factor only, like lipids, for example, elevated lipids, is the results of an experiment that if I reduce that, if I intervene in it, I can change the natural history of outcome. And that's what got hyperlipidemia turned into hyperlipidemia. So too systolic hypertension in elderly people. Clinical trials. I haven't yet seen those clinical trials with beta amyloid in asymptomatic individuals to allow me to reach that conclusion. So I'll stop there.
So let me add to that with a bit of a disclosure, and that is we are funded, we are NIA funded to develop amyloid vaccines. And I do that and I endorse that. And I said, let's give a try to amyloid vaccines that will essentially bust plaques in people who are asymptomatic, maybe even in people who don't have plaques.
That is a vision of the future.
Okay.
Yep.
And that is from the point of view that you can't have dementia. You can't have cognitive impairment. You can't have this Alzheimer's disease cognitive impairment if you don't have plaques. Okay. Now, having said that, back to exactly what Jason said, we're confronted with the idea that a bunch of people in their 70s without cognitive impairment, that 40 or 50% of them will have plaques, do have plaques, and that the vast majority of them do not go on to develop symptoms. A somewhat lesser proportion of those people could be said to have the equivalent of tau, of neurofibrillary tangles, of tau tangles. They also don't have symptoms. A few more of them will develop symptoms than the people who have amyloid alone. Yet, still, most of them will not over the course of the rest of their lifetime. The next part to this is that the research that's actually done on this, where we'd say things like, oh, well, if you have this amount of amyloid, you are somewhat more likely to progress to Alzheimer's disease than if you have a little less amyloid. If you have amyloid and tau together, you're somewhat more likely than if you have a lot of amyloid alone. And this is very serious because you will then decline more probably in terms of cognitive impairment. But then when you look at those studies carefully, you see something else, and that is that the studies are inherently flawed because the people who have a lot of amyloid are somewhat more cognitively worse than the people who have a little abnormal amyloid, and the people who have amyloid and tau score a little bit more cognitively worse than the people who have a lot of amyloid. And you can measure this. They're not cognitively impaired, but you can measure this. And what you see is that those are the people who then progress to develop dementia and further cognitive impairment. So in my view, you can't have this illness unless you start to show symptoms. If you don't show symptoms now, your likelihood, it's clearly a risk factor, but your likelihood is much, much lower. And that conflation there is a real problem. So I'll just stop with one sentence. So what the Alzheimer's Association in this group is trying to do is reductionistically reduce Alzheimer's disease to amyloid equals Alzheimer's pathology. Amyloid plus tau biomarkers equals Alzheimer's disease. That's all you have to know. That's the disease. It exists on a continuum. And knock your socks off. And I think that is inherently limiting, inherently reductionistic, and then doesn't take into account all the other pathology that occurs in our brains that is related to aging and other illness.
I'm probably the person who knows the least about this in this podcast, because I know Eric's been really interested. Of course, the three of you are directors of centers that study this issue and deeply involved. And so, what Lon and Heather and Jason just said raises some issues for me that our listeners may be wondering about. And one is, ought these social considerations, the stigma, as Jason put it, play a role in determining how Alzheimer's disease is defined, like the very definition of Alzheimer's disease?
What do you think, Heather? It's you that raised it.
I think we have an obligation to do that. I think that it's premature to push out a new revised framework. And I say that as a person that probably, at least I think I'm in a different part of the spectrum than Lon. I'm not quite sure yet where Jason is, but I'm more accepting of the idea that if we had a perfect biomarker for the kind of amyloidopathy that normally leads to Alzheimer's disease, I would be okay calling that Alzheimer's disease from a scientific standpoint in people who don't yet have symptoms. And I could see benefits to doing that for being able to target therapies if we had therapies and develop therapies that would be better. The problem is, I think we have an obligation to the living humans today to recognize that that's a sea change from how most of the world thinks of the word Alzheimer's disease. And by rushing this into sort of clinical practice and suddenly saying people that have positive amyloid based on an imperfect biomarker, especially, now they have Alzheimer's disease, I think we're opening massive potential for harm and distress and predatory practices upon these people. And that's where I sort of just want to pump the brakes on taking what I see as a very helpful research framework rushed into clinical care.
Yeah, so I would say, if I'm going to put my cards on the table, but someone with cognitive impairment, whether it's causing inefficiencies or disabilities in daily living, otherwise known as MCI or dementia, I think the role of biomarkers is very clear to help sort out what's causing that problem. And if they have elevated amyloid and meet other criteria, there's even the treatments now available.
Right.
Okay, that's that. I think, though, once we push into the space of someone who, pounded with cognitive testing and monitoring, is doing fine, I think considerations of saying, well, you've got Alzheimer's, you've got elevated amyloid, I think that the matters of cultural and social stigmas should be thought about. But if someone showed me that an intervention in those individuals could change the natural history of decline, I'd say, look, we're just going to have to work through those stigmas because I've got some way to alter that natural history. And indeed, as we saw with HIV, there's certainly still a stigma that surrounds HIV, but the ability to treat HIV very much transformed the nature of what it is like to have that disease. And we can go through any number of diseases where that's the case, mental illnesses, et cetera. I'm not saying they're stigma-free, I'm not. But these will be ongoing cultural conversations. I guess I'm just sticking to the sort of position that I would like someday to be able to diagnose Alzheimer's as well as Lewy body disease, et cetera, before someone has disabling impairments. I would, absolutely. But I don't think that right now the science says that elevated amyloid alone is the label Alzheimer's, which engenders the notion that it's a valid construct. I don't think the construct has been validated. I want to see results of studies like the AHEAD study, Trailblazer 3. These are studies testing drugs in individuals who are cognitively unimpaired and yet have markers of elevated amyloid and or also tau. Those results will be very compelling to have me change my view.
Well,
and you're talking about intervention studies, and there's a whole set of studies that I also want to see, which is just population studies of these biomarkers in observational populations of young people to understand how many of them have these biomarkers. Yeah,
I'm with you on the observational data, but I think observational data alone to define a disease are very slender read. Having said that, clinical trials have their faults as well, but they're very compelling experiments to validate causation. And that's what I find very compelling.
So back to the licensing of PET scans and amyloid PET scans, that is, not tau, and the Alzheimer's Association and definition. The entire, everything is tied to the PET scan, to the amyloid PET scan in terms of this kind of diagnosis. And the PET scan, the amyloid PET scan itself, was definitionally validated, if that's a term, against pathologic specimens. And it was imperfectly correlated with pathologic specimens. So you take these people who were near death and you get a PET scan, and you wait 6 months, 8 months until they die, and then you try to correlate this. And there's a really, really, really great correlation, but it's still only about 0.9 or 0.95. This is not good enough. And then you start going backwards, and that is with one particular ligand. The other ligands are different, and they will have different correlations. The way to read the PET scan also vary. The way to administer the ligand, the tracer, also varies. The way to read it also varies and has error. Now, that has become the gold standard. That has become the standard against which you then develop other biomarkers. And you see the problem. Each biomarker is in itself going to be imperfect against that gold standard. And not only that, it's going to be even misleading depending on the population you use. If you use an older population with a high prevalence of amyloid, it'll sound better than if you use the biomarker in 50-year-olds.
And
this is just mathematics. And
let's be honest, probably 99% of these studies are mostly in white populations. Is that right?
I think before you get to that, they're mostly in populations that are made to be extreme comparisons. Let's get some people who are dementia from our research clinics who have dementia, and then let's get controls. Where are we going to get controls?
College.
We'll get alumni, we'll get retired professors. And now you have this great extreme comparison. And then there are variations on that theme.
Right. And I think, and I'm willing, all those issues that Lon has raised, I think the AV45 and related amyloid scans and the tau scan, the one that is commercially available, I think the data support their use in individuals who have clinical disease, okay? With all the caveats around the potential. I think what you're getting at, Lon, though, is there's still enough noise in the system to say it is a bold reach to use those results in individuals of younger ages who are asymptomatic and call that a disease. I think that's where I think we're struggling.
Even in older people, the two gold standards become, in living people, it's some sort of an amyloid PET scan, but this was validated against people who had basically a certain set of agreed upon pathologic criteria for after they died for Alzheimer's disease. Severely impaired people, because those are the ones who die, and let's say the names of the criteria are variously Reagan criteria or NIA criteria for the pathology of Alzheimer's disease. And those two are inherently imperfect because you've made a diagnosis based on, the pathologist has made a diagnosis based on plaque, tangles, loss of neurons, but also includes people who have vascular disease, who have other proteinopathy. So if you look hard enough, you kind of find that this kind of pure Alzheimer's pathology that was conceptualized more than 100 years ago is really uncommon. It doesn't really stand alone. So that some pathologists, Julie Schneider, for instance, at Rush University, likes to say that that Alzheimer's disease is the least common cause of Alzheimer's disease, and she speaks at it from a pathologic point of view.
I'm gonna set Eric up with a softball thrown over the middle of the plate here.
I need softballs on this one. As the group here.
As a lay listener who doesn't, not deeply invested in tangles and plaques, etc., I'm interested in hearing what's the push behind this shift. What is the driving force here? And some deep suspicion and concern that money is the driving factor.
Yeah, I think, when I think about this, and would love your all thoughts, is that I do think there is a strong push, and this is just an example. I think it's an exemplar of kind of this push generally from industry to relabel or rethink thresholds for disease so more and more people have that disease. It is not just Alzheimer's disease. Low T is a great example. So low testosterone. Now every older man has low T and new diagnosis. You can see this with diabetes. You see the same thing. You have pre-diabetes now. The threshold is not just to define the disease, but to change that threshold so more and more people have it, more and more drugs can be used. And then the question is who gets to define these diseases? And if you look who gets to define this, is pretty well documented. The who in the room who defines it is heavily industry biased. So the NIAA guidelines that have been being drafted out, a third of the people in the work group are directly employed by industry. Another third have significant conflict of interests, and the other third don't.
Actually, it's more than half when you include the 4 advisors and the 10 reviewers added to those 22 on the committee. And then you have to actually look at the document and ask, did any one of these 36 people read the document from cover to cover? Because it doesn't read well.
Yeah, and they actually had to change the word guidelines in it because they can't call it guidelines because this is not how you create a guideline. You're supposed to have really good, there are now guidelines on how to make guidelines, and you have to address conflicts of interest and minimize them. And this is not how you do it with a third of the people coming from industry and making these guidelines. So, and this is, again, just an example. I wish it was just this, but we see this with a lot of these changes and thresholds of how we define disease.
Welcome to the world. Welcome to the world that we live in. Which I'm not trying to. Welcome to the world that we live in. It is a fact, though, that, and I think Jeremy Green nicely documents this in his book, Prescribing by Numbers, that a variety of diseases, particularly diseases that exist along pathophysiological, pathological dimensionality, are in part defined by drugs. Because those experiments show that the actor being targeted, lipids, for example, is part of the causal pathway to an undesired event. Now, that's just criterion validation.
Can I ask real quick about that? So does amyloid fit that? Because when you look at
amyloid,
donanemab, it doesn't. It slows down the progression, but people still progress.
Yeah, people still get heart attacks.
These drugs are perfectly designed. These are the best antibodies that you can ever imagine. Several of them. What they do is that they kill fibrils. They kill plaques. That's how they were designed, and that's how they work. And these medicinal and immunologists are just great. This is a success, period. Now go on with that.
Okay, well, but my point was, my point is, the social political reality is, of course, that drugs are patented inventions that are owned, the diagnostic tests similarly, and so all of a sudden you have this very interesting phenomena that occurred in late 20th century and into 21st century America, is that the definition of diseases is wrapped up in the business of developing drugs and diagnostics. That's just the fact, and I think that is a bit disturbing because the individuals who own inventions, OWN, have been part of the process by which we say that defines that disease. And I do think that creates a little bit of disquiet where the borders between the expert physicians will decide what is a disease, freed of all conflicts, is a historical event. And I do think, that efforts to define diseases where they require tests that people own, the results of drug studies, drugs that people own, I think we have to pay attention to the fact that matters of ownership now are wrapped up in the definition of diseases. And that is something I think we need to think about.
And I guess can I make one more point on
please,
this topic?
Heather.
So I completely applaud skepticism and paying attention to where the money's coming from and who's getting the money and what people's conflicts are. Completely applaud it. A little bit in defense of the field, though, I want to also say that I think that some of it is motivated by genuine belief out there that our best chance to help people is to detect them earlier and earlier in the disease process and before they have symptoms. And so, and I think all of the, again, with cautions to pooled analyses and sub-analyses and comparing across different trials. But if you take all of the signs, they all point in the same way, which is that the earlier in the disease process and before, as early in symptomatology as possible, is the time that you get the best benefit from any of the antibody drugs.
And from a public health perspective, that's what you'd want as well. I mean, why wait until you're disabled to treat a disease? So that's a values perspective too. Yeah, no, and I agree. I mean, I would like the day where Alzheimer's and Lewy body disease and FTLD are diagnosed before people have to surrender a certain degree of liberty and suffer impairments in their mind. So I share that vision. It's just that we're doing it in the context of the social and political structure, which sometimes is not aligned with the interests of patients.
So can we go back to, I agree with that, and maybe it should transcend back to drug companies and NIH and the Alzheimer's Association.
And the lab companies. Quest just came out with a direct-to-consumer, test kit for amyloid.
Well, it's look, we measure every biomarker we can. we invent biomarkers to measure as well. I mean, we're all for that. That's a research issue. If the Alzheimer's Association should say something like plasma A beta biomarkers are good, and enough experts agree, then why shouldn't a company that's good at measuring stuff try to market it? And that's all Quest is doing, is trying to market an assay for a protein. Then the pushback is from some of the stakeholders is, oh, well, you can't do that. You can't just give that value to a patient. He wouldn't know what to do with it. You need a specialist, a subspecialist, to be able to evaluate that. I mean, you can't even let geriatricians take a look at this measurement, and it costs $250, and all this other stuff that gets in the way of kind of the ordinary business of medicine. I think that is really a side issue. I think the main real issue here is that we allowed a definition in order to help develop drugs. We've allowed a definition of Alzheimer's disease and a surrogate marker to take the place of a clinical syndrome and a clinical outcome in drug development. So you have the idea Alzheimer's disease equals amyloid. If you get rid of amyloid, you must no longer have Alzheimer's disease. And so these several antibodies do get rid of amyloid, and that's good enough. That's
right. But what we're all waiting for is show me Trailblazer 3, show me AHEAD, show me these other studies that would show that. We don't have that. And I don't think that donanemab and lecanemab are compelling data to make that conclusion in people who lack evidence of elevated tau, who lack evidence of cognitive impairment.
The entire field changes if there are clearly positive studies.
Obviously. Like Alex and go ahead.
So Jason, can I ask you a question? Because you brought up atherosclerotic heart disease. So I'd imagine if I have a drug that targets plaques, atherosclerotic plaques, it makes those plaques go away, I no longer have atherosclerotic heart disease after I've taken out.
Well, no, you had it because you still have it, but because of
I don't have it anymore. They're gone.
Well, no, you have the disease because you required treatment.
Well, if I had lung cancer and I got the lung cancer cured, I don't still have lung cancer. So I guess the question is where, like, we're comparing this to we're comparing it to cancer, we're comparing it to diabetes, We're comparing to all these other things, but how much of it is really comparing versus should we just separate? So you have beta amyloidosis. You have high levels of beta amyloid, which may result in Alzheimer's disease, which is a clinical syndrome. Or are we saying this is like hypercholesterolemia, is that there's always going to be a cutoff. You're always going to have some level of cholesterol, which may result in some bad thing happening in the future, like cardiovascular disease. And you're always going to have this.
So Heather, you may please weigh in. I think this is what the field still needs to figure out.
Yeah, Heather, you had strong opinions on this.
Yeah, I've heard this debated actually of if they're going to have to add a new classification for people who had Alzheimer's disease, but now they don't because their drugs removed their pathological features of it. So it is a thing that has occurred to people of that if we end up with people who were biomarker positive people and now they're not because they've been treated, would we say they used to have Alzheimer's disease?
That's right. So, I go to my group. I'm Lon Schneider. I am an Alzheimer's survivor for 5 years, every day at a time.
I just imagine if Lon's treatment comes true, you get your vaccine for Alzheimer's disease, you get rid of all your amyloid. You still don't have flu. If you've had flu 2 years ago, I guess you can call yourself a flu survivor.
I think we're walking into an area that I think we haven't talked about, which we ought to, which is the public health implications of a redefinition of disease on counting the disease and claiming what the burden of it is. And I do think that needs some discussion. Yeah. So to date, the way we say count Alzheimer's is still the figures that are put forward by NIA and the Alzheimer's Association is reliant on individuals having some evidence of cognitive impairment. The Alzheimer's
That's right,
Association,
6 million U.S. adults, somewhere around.
That number relies on having at least MCI based on the data they used in the Chicago study. If you define the disease on the basis of amyloid alone and you want to count Alzheimer's disease, you obviously would start, I don't know, go to the HRS data set and look at, pooled bloods from that and test them for amyloid, and you could come up with an estimate of the prevalence of Alzheimer's. It will be a dramatically larger number, which I guarantee will make headlines, but it's a very different Alzheimer's than the Alzheimer's that today has preoccupied America's attention, has preoccupied policymakers' attention. And the worry I have is just that, the misinterpretation of that number and almost a creation of constituencies in the plural with Alzheimer's. Well, yeah, you've got the beta amyloid Alzheimer's and otherwise are fine. I've got the Alzheimer's that has me needing someone to manage my checkbook. I don't drive anymore. And, I rely on someone else to handle my meals. Those are two very different ways of living with the disease. And I think we have to think a bit about the policy implications there that would flow from that new way of counting the disease. But again, if we could validate that some biomarker measure does quantify Alzheimer's disease independent of symptoms, and we may get there, that would be the way we would count the disease. But then we're going to have to also count the disease based on clinical severity to not lose sight of the fact that dementia matters, and that's why we care about this disease. Mm-hmm. If you didn't get dementia, it wouldn't be a problem.
And I heard, is that about right? Like 1 out of 10 50-year-olds will have amyloid positivity as far as...
Yeah, and I'll tell you, in our study where we do very young people with family histories, we're finding people in their 20s that cross the threshold for abnormal amyloid on lumbar punctures.
Which would then be defined as Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah. So
20-year-old with Alzheimer's disease.
And
wow.
People in their 20s, but strong family history. And then the scary thing is, many of these people who knows what the population prevalence is? We don't normally do lumbar punctures on healthy people in their 20s.
And for 80-year-olds, what's the prevalence of having positive amyloid biomarkers?
50%, at least on a PET scan, if not a majority for 80-year-olds.
Yeah.
But is that people who have presented because of some cognitive or memory concern?
That's a straight out screen. That's 40% or so of people in their 70s who have no cognitive impairments as screened will have a positive amyloid PET scan. Another factoid is the recent Mayo Clinic longitudinal study report from, I forget the author's first name, Podick, I think, is that 8% of people with a positive amyloid scan, only 8% of people would be eligible to receive lecanemab. So that kind of puts disease or symptomatology in one relationship to just having a positive amyloid PET scan. You can go with that as you will. I just one thing I want to come back to what Heather said about finding quote unquote Alzheimer profiles of amyloid and tau in younger people's CSF. Essentially, we have no standards. Essentially, you don't really know how abnormal that is or what is going on in those 20-year-olds, because all the work, or the vast majority of the work, was done in older folk.
Precisely.
So let me. I hope that 5, 10, I don't know how many years from now, this conversation will be viewed as very historical, because it was all about amyloid. And 5 to 10 years from now, we will have developed ways of measuring the brain that allow you to say whose brain is beginning to showing signs of neuron dysfunction, neuron death. And I think that's the exciting field that is unfolding. Measures like neurofilament light, GFAP, measures of neuroinflammation, neurodegeneration, some of which are agnostic to disease. They just indicate whether neurons are dysfunctional or dying. And so I would say to my colleagues on the listening and watching, the few, don't be cynical about biomarkers. I think the one takeaway I wouldn't want people to have is these biomarkers are just the latest flagpole sitting. This is the beginning of a new way of measuring and defining the brain in health and disease. I think amyloid got a lot of attention because it was one of the first markers to be developed. and the work they did was beautiful and elegant. Tau was very compelling. But again, measures like neurofilament light, GFAP, et cetera, are very exciting measures that could allow you to say, yeah, you've got amyloid, but you've got no neurofilament, no GFAP. Things look really quiet versus you've got amyloid and you've got evidence that there's active neurodegeneration going on. I see this as our future, and we need to get ready for it.
But what you're addressing, though, is what is it that you're measuring, and what does that thing that you're measuring actually mean? So when you're measuring amyloid fibrils, you're measuring this extracellular clump of stuff that's a reaction to injury and probably has nothing to do with the cellular pathology of what's going on. And when you're looking at something like GFAP, you're looking at something particular about glial cells and their state of activation, which may have very little to do with amyloid.
But may have a lot to do with brains not working well.
Right.
So
exactly.
I guess, I want to be mindful of the time. We're getting close to the hour. I like Jason's point. It's like, what's the take home for our listeners, the people here? I'm hearing from Jason, like, don't give up on biomarkers here. That this
Absolutely. Do not give up on biomarkers.
Heather, what's your take home?
All right, so you can tell that I'm a fan of your show because I prepared my magic wand answer. Which is so. So if I had a magic wand, it would be and I think Jason would want to use my magic wand too, which is that we would understand the mechanisms of this disease, meaning the disease that leads to dementia and the symptoms people care about. We would understand the mechanism well enough to have the perfect biomarker that detected that. And then I agree, we'd be all about developing treatments against that and detecting the biomarker as soon as we could and treating it.
Yeah. How about for you, Lon?
So we don't understand the pathology and pathophysiology of this thing we call Alzheimer's disease. We do understand how to diagnose it by microscopically, essentially by pathology. And we do see and expect, as with all illness, to be able to develop diagnostic tests for this illness. But this is a work in progress. So we're not going to be able to talk about individual diagnostic tests today or tomorrow. We can see what's coming up. We can be pretty optimistic. We can also be optimistic that we'll understand the cellular pathology of neurodegeneration, which would include Alzheimer's disease processes and other things. But having said that, we do have at least one clinically useful set of biomarkers. And those are amyloid biomarkers and probably very, very soon phosphatase biomarkers in blood that are clinically useful in the sense that if a person does have cognitive impairment, and cognitive impairment is largely memory impairment, cortical, slow, progressive impairment, and doesn't have another obvious reason for having cognitive impairment, and you do get a positive amyloid biomarker, such as a amyloid PET scan or a CSF profile with phosphatase and tau, that is really, really reinforcing that you can give this person a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease and Alzheimer's disease pathology. They do have plaque entangled disease and they do have neurodegeneration.
And 2 cheers for MRI, Lon. Don't forget the value of MRI.
And hopefully better interventions in the future so they won't forget about you.
Yeah.
Don't you forget about me. I say la 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 when you walk on by. La 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 la, will you call my name?
Heather, Jason, Lon, thanks for joining us for the Jerry Powell Podcast.
Thanks a lot, Eric. Thanks a lot, Alex.
That was a blast. And thank you to all of our listeners for your support. And we'd like to say a special thank you to those Jerry Powell listeners who've donated more than $250.
Including Susan Nelson, Christopher Heck, Lindsay Yorman, Mo Rizawi, Sue Borson, Carrie Rubenstein, Marissa Galicia Castillo, Cara Bischoff, Kate Mesrich, James Tulsky, Louise Aronson, Asher Edwards, Mark Apfel, Michael Bordowski, Dwayne Dobschutz, Frisch Brandt, Kelly Strait, Daryl Owens, Roseanne Leipzig, Elizabeth Chung, Amis Samoji, Harry Hahn, Nick Schneeman, Ed Martin, Jeff and Lena Galbraith, Himanshu Malhotra, Nina Flanagan, Penelope Thompson, Lloyd Woolstat, Mark Wren, Carol Heyman, and Bob Rixey.
Thanks, everyone.